to the Biblical Preaching Podcast, and we are joined today by Jonathan Lamb. Now, I've met Jonathan a while ago, 16, 17 years ago, only met him once in London, and getting to know each other, and then I got to work with his organization, as it was, Langham Preaching. But Jonathan's got a rich history. He was ministering in a church in Exeter not too long before that. Worked with, well, it probably was. He worked with IFES, International Student Ministry, for many, many years. Worked with Langham Preaching, which was where I connected with him, training preachers across the world. And he's also been chairman and on the council, whatever it's called, of Keswick Convention. So really diverse experience, and I'm sure you're going to benefit from what Jonathan has to say. So he's going to talk a little bit in this clip about some of those kind of complexities of crossing cultures in terms of preaching and training preachers. And please don't switch off, because even if you're not involved in traveling cross-culturally in order to train preachers, because that is quite niche, there's not many of us that get to do that. But even without that, I think there's quite a bit for us to take on board and to think about in this whole realm of culture and preaching. And so let's listen to Jonathan, and then we will just talk through some of those implications for us. Well, Jonathan, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.
Thank you.
You've got a lot of experience, and I'm not suggesting that you're old or anything like that, but you've done a lot over the past decades. And I think for me, the two areas where I'm sort of most aware of your ministry are Langham Preaching and Keswick Ministries. Mm-hmm. What's the kind of current situation? Are you specifically in one area, or are you still involved with different ones?
You're right. I'm on the way to getting old, and so I'm not formally employed by any one agency, but continue to work in support, particularly of Keswick Ministries at the moment, which is not only in the UK but globally. I still do some preaching training in Europe, and keep in touch with all of my Langham Preaching friends and colleagues, and also a little bit with IFES, the student ministry around the world, so alongside local church activity. So yeah, we have enough to keep us busy.
That's great. So can we just go to the Langham Preaching? That's where we first connected, and I was privileged to do a few courses in Central Asia and Romania with Langham. Can you give us a kind of a snapshot of Langham Preaching, what it is and why it matters?
Yes. It grew out of the ministry of John Stott, actually. I guess most of our listeners will remember him, a great preacher and writer. And he was quite concerned as he travelled globally that although the church was growing rapidly in the majority world, Africa, Asia, Latin America and elsewhere, the resources were quite slim. In other words, people were involved in leading churches or preaching or trying to give leadership without very much support or training. And so various programs were developed, one of which was trying to equip people at a more theological level, the Langham Scholars, which was a PhD program. One was literature, Langham Literature, which now provides books for seminaries and pastors and churches all around the world, large numbers, and also support writers and libraries and so on, and publishers. But the one in which I was involved right at the beginning was Langham Preaching, which was an attempt to try to find ways of encouraging and training and equipping pastors, lay preachers, evangelists, church planters in many parts of the world where they had no training and very little in the way of resources. Quite large numbers globally, as you will know, maybe 70% or more of pastors have had no formal training, in some countries with very limited resources. So we tried to work on a simple model that would help to train and equip the preachers, the regular preachers in these congregations, particularly in the majority world. And then gradually over the years that's extended into little training programs in many, many countries. It's become increasingly indigenous with local leaders and trainers. now in just over 100 countries, in fact, and many similar preaching movements within those countries. So in a few moments, that's exactly how it's developed, and its intention is really to try to provide indigenous, ongoing training and support. One of the good things about it, I think, is not only are there training seminars, but the great genius has been establishing small preachers' groups or clubs or escuelitas, as they call them in Latin America, little preachers' schools, which might meet weekly or monthly, and they'll work together on Bible passages, and they'll share their thoughts and ideas and then preach, sometimes on the same passage in their different churches. But the great benefit of that is a sort of degree of accountability and support and prayer, as well as working together. A lot of preachers, as we know, are very lonely in their work, have to do it all without much reference to others. And so these little groups, there are thousands of them now around the world, I think are quite a significant element of the training and ongoing support process. So that's what it's how it was founded and how it's developing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I loved every time I was involved. It was a real privilege to be doing something that just felt so incredibly strategic.
Yes,
You know, there's lots of invitations, lots of opportunities to preach, but to equip people who would then use it and train others.
exactly. It has this multiplying effect, which is
Yeah.
particularly good. Yeah.
So I know we talked about this when we met a long time ago, but I suppose one of the fashionable trends in recent years has been to kind of critique foreign missions input, or you're just importing a cultural model. Now, I think with preaching, that's a particular risk, isn't it? It'd be quite easy, I would imagine, to kind of come in and try to get people to preach in an English way rather
Yes.
than in a biblical way. How have you avoided that? And how would you even define the difference? What would you see as that kind of risk?
You're absolutely right, and I think the literature and the discussion at the moment about the dangers of this kind of colonialist, imperialist approaches, it's a good critique and an important one, and we haven't always been sufficiently alert to it. I've always been aware of the fact that, particularly when we began with Langham, but also in IFES, I've been involved in student ministry around the world. The great danger of importing ideas or styles which aren't appropriate to the culture, that's one obvious one. There's a certain power dynamic which can sometimes operate. So Westerners like myself coming in, flying into a relatively poor part of the world with funds and books, and there's a certain element where you could easily see that becoming manipulative or the wrong use of power or influence. Some cultures, of course, are very, very gracious towards visitors and probably wouldn't even tell us if we were putting our foot in it. So it's a delicate area, and I think you're right to raise it. For me, the ways in which we sought to overcome that, and I'm not involved officially in Langham anymore, but I notice the developments around the world which are addressing the very issue you raise. One is the simplicity of the model that was used. In other words, there are some universal issues which preachers, whatever culture they're in, have to give attention to. So we all have, well, not all, but most of us have the Bible. Some countries we've worked in, even that is a resource that's scarce. But let's assume that most people have access to a Bible, and ideally in their own language. So the issue of how to read and understand and then to communicate that's a universal challenge in all churches globally. I think in Langham, the attempt has been to look at some fundamental issues of understanding Scripture, but to give absolute liberty with regard to the way in which that's communicated, the way in which, the classic idea of bridge building, here's the Word of God and here's our culture. The bridge building exercise into culture and into application and into supporting and serving the local church. All of that has to be done locally and by those who understand those dynamics. So I think the attempt has been to provide some basic tools which can be easily modified in terms of understanding the scripture, and some basic ideas in terms of the bridge building task into the culture without that being prescriptive or dominant. And early on in the process in Langham, there's a strong emphasis on identifying the trainers, the facilitators, the group leaders who are from the culture where we're working. So quite quickly, I've noticed it more so now in these 100 countries or more, huge numbers. In fact, I don't know the figures, but the vast majority of countries are now being led by nationals in that country. The rollout is being done in relation to the nature of the church and its issues, and the application of the preaching is all done in that way. So I think quite quickly it's important to ensure there is this process of indigenization and local ownership. And I think by God's grace that's happened pretty well within Langham, and indeed amongst the other agencies which are doing something similar. There are quite a few other good agencies trying to do the same. I think we have to be very careful about that the celebrity preachers flying in and doing pre-rehearsed material in a way which doesn't really connect with the local context. So it's really important that quite quickly the ownership is taken on locally, I think. It's a big issue. So those are my very quick first observations, but you're welcome to push back on any of that.
No, not at all. I totally agree. I think it's probably helpful for people to kind of pause and think through what is the alternative, in the sense of if people are completely untrained, they've had no Bible school, they've had no equipping, and very limited resources in many locations or many languages. What do you think? Is it that does the sort of untrained preaching style of country A, does that have the same features as the untrained preaching style of country B? Is it just an untrained is always the same and it's always a problem? Or are there also sort of cultural elements where certain cultures pull preachers in a certain direction?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that really, but I think on the whole, my experience in the countries where I've travelled and worked with Langham and others, there is a certain degree in which you spot the same trends. The fact that very often there isn't much time given to preparation of reading and understanding the Bible. That's very common. So I remember one pastor who was only involved briefly in the Langham program, but what he gained, he once said at the subsequent event, this has taken the panic out of Saturday night. In other words, it's the night before you've got to preach where you wonder, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? I've met some who even try to think about that as they walk to church on the Sunday morning. In other words, very often people are not engaging and preparing and reading and even with no resources are not trying to understand what the passage means. Another danger, of course, which is true in our own culture, is that people then jump off on something from a passage which clearly is not what the passage itself really meant. And that's a common mistake for all preachers, and why the disciplines of trying to understand what the author meant and how we might express it today is a fundamental thing. So I think there's a great degree of commonality, even in Western countries too, where we might have resources available, where people are not preparing and not working on the scriptures and not thinking about their congregation or their audience, whatever it might be. The same mistakes tend to bubble up. I think the way in sometimes in those contexts has been to talk with people who have some degree of pastoral responsibility for their congregation. In other words, what is it that your brothers and sisters really need on this Sunday morning? What are the issues, the connecting points that really matter? And how can the Bible help you to address those issues and speak pastorally to your congregation? For me, that resonates with a lot of people. They know that they've got an important job to do. They feel inadequate, as we all do very often. And they don't really have the resources. So thinking about how this Bible passage or this verse connects with some of the needs my congregation is facing is a fundamental way in, I think. You're right to ask the question about whether some cultures have more problems in this area than others. I'm not sure I can answer that intelligently. What's your own experience? What do you think?
I think I wouldn't say it's impossible to know if some have more than others, but I suspect that different cultures will, that while some things will be commonalities, there will also be some features,
Yes.
that are specific to a culture that, you sort of need to overcome.
Yes.
I'm just thinking in my own mind, one country that comes to mind where there's a tendency to kind of overstudy and then information transfer, so you hear
Yes.
someone who's a very compelling, clear communicator in conversation, but the moment they're preaching, it's just, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just a feature of kind of their education. I don't
Yes.
know,
And
learn
then,
as much as you can and cram it into an essay.
yes. And that we could be guilty of that here, can't we? There's the same danger of very good material from the text without landing in people's lives, or
Yeah.
landing in people's lives without very good material from the text. So there's sort of a problem there. And also, I think sometimes that the models that we have in our different cultures can play a part. There are some countries where the best preaching is seen to be really loud, shouting, glossy, pacing up and down, wearing white suits, or there's all kinds of cultural stuff that can go into the business of
Yeah.
what makes for quotes powerful preaching, and we can sometimes ape or model that for not having a better idea of what we're seeking to do. So I think it's a good question culturally.
I'm not sure that it's not that we might copy it. It's that if that's all we know,
Yes,
that's what we will do, isn't it?
it
And
is.
so if somebody has only ever known preaching as kind of powerful rhetoric that touches, uses Bible language,
Yes.
then it's easy to sort of sit on the outside of that and criticize it. But if that's all they've ever heard,
Precisely. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But by and large, I think what has been encouraging from my point of view, just watching how the Langham program and others have developed, is to see those movements in different countries begin to mature. Some of them have been going now for 20 years or more, and take on their own cultural style and approach and resourcing materials that they themselves are writing, training models that they've developed. In fact, even this idea of the little preachers groups, the escuelitas as I call them, was originally a Latin American idea, which is now borrowed and used globally. So I think the other advantage of cross-cultural work is that we can pick up and learn from what others are finding useful and are deploying in their own culture, which are transferable,
Right.
including for us in the West.
It's not automatically I'm just bringing British or I'm
Exactly.
bringing English. It's like actually Latin America find this helpful.
Yes.
You're just the postman of the idea, aren't you?
That's exactly right. And I think that fits with our understanding of the global church and global mission, is that we're part of that wide family, and we're not in the business of just exporting British or Western cultural models. We're in the business of learning from each other. The Latin Americans have also introduced many of us to praying the word, the idea of working together on a Bible passage first by spending a lot of time praying that passage together. And it's another simple idea which has really been a valuable export from Latin America to those of us elsewhere who perhaps jump in quickly with our study before the reflective, meditative mode that Latin Americans bring. So I think that kind of constant transfer is what we need to keep working at and praying for.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the joys I've felt with training preachers is you don't come in sort of as an authority saying this is how you should preach, but you're introducing them perhaps for the first time to the fact that the Bible is worth hearing. Do you see what I mean? So they may have only ever heard the Bible kind of picked at and used as sort of vocabulary.
Yes.
But suddenly studying a passage and working through it and realizing, oh, that's what that's saying. I'm feeling fed even in the process. And then
Exactly.
there's an excitement to share that with your church.
That is, and that comes across. That the fact that it is owned by you inevitably comes across to the congregation. And if it's not owned by me as the preacher, then I'm in trouble, really. So you're absolutely right. And helping people, I think, to gain confidence in the authority, but also the power of the Bible. I love, the lovely, well-known verse, 1 Thessalonians 2:13, where Paul talks about he's thankful that the Thessalonians received the word of God, which is the word of God as it actually is, he says, which is at work in you who believe. So this emphasis on its authority, the word of God, but the lovely phrase, it's at work in you who believe, is I think, something that's really heartening for preachers to grasp. And I've seen that happen many times where people suddenly realise, well, it's not down to my particular skills, although those are important. It is the power of God's word at work in a congregation or in my life, which makes the biggest difference. So those are good things to remember.
Well, I think it's obvious Jonathan is experienced. He's a bit of a statesman, a bit of a legend in some ways. But yeah, faithful ministry over many years, and lots to glean from him.
Yeah, there's a clarity of his thought, I think, that I was really struck with. That comes from, like I was saying, just decades of walking with Jesus and walking with him in an absolute ton of different countries and different situations, and kind of big things, small things. There's a sort of a wisdom and clarity of thought that he was sharing, and particularly to some of the global cultural lessons that he was able to share is fascinating.
And with Jonathan, I don't know how much it came through on the interview, but a really lovely humility.
Yeah, exactly.
He's not excited about himself. He's excited about the ministry and about God, but yeah, a real humble, kind, wonderful man.
Yeah. So one of the things that we were kind of thinking of reflecting on is like you said at the beginning, just the cross-cultural or crossing cultures in preaching particularly, and that's something which he has done many, many, many times. And it's interesting that he was reflecting a bit on sort of the different types of preaching culture in some of the different countries that he was saying. So, some of the models of preaching throughout the world are different in each region of the world, really.
Yeah, and you get a feel for that if you have the privilege of traveling, and even just visiting churches, you get a feel for it. But certainly teaching preachers, which I've been able to do a little bit internationally. Even in the West, an American preacher typically is different than a British preacher. Typically, that there's variation on both sides of the ocean, but there is something American, and there is something British, and there is something Italian, and and then once you go Central Asia and Sri Lanka and Africa, other countries where I've been able to go, there are distinctives to each culture, and you want to honor that, you want to appreciate that, but you also need to recognize it, because with each strength there comes a weakness.
I think one of the things I think Langham do quite well is when they're teaching preachers in all of those different countries and regions that you've mentioned, they're not teaching British preaching.
Right.
They're teaching biblical preaching.
Yeah, and they're very conscious of that.
Yeah, and that's just really superb, and I really value that form, because I can certainly think the preaching that I'm used to in this country, or in the West, if you want to kind of call it that, that is the way. And anything that's a bit African or a bit South American
or a bit Asian or whatever, a bit anything,
is therefore wrong.
Yeah,
because it's not what I'm used to, or quite not comfortable for me.
Yeah, and sometimes it's purely the comfort of what I'm familiar with. And sometimes there probably is an arrogance in terms of our education system and our culture and, sort of civilized societies, and so you can easily end up putting your foot in it, even without intentionally doing so, just kind of assuming a sort of old school imperialistic idea. But I don't think that's as common as people make out. I think there is generally, I've sensed a humility in Westerners traveling into Africa or into Asia. Not always. Sometimes it's very ugly and it's very awkward. But often there is a humility and a recognition that there's a lot we can learn. There are differences that can be celebrated. Not every difference is a negative. But you don't want to swing too far the other way where every difference is a positive.
Yeah.
And that is quite common in some circles.
Yeah, that's true. And I think Jonathan said in the clip that we've just listened to that there are some more universal issues that sort of almost transcend kind of the cultural differences that we've been saying, that actually the challenges of handling the Bible and engaging with the Bible, that should resonate more with me than the style. Like we've been saying, actually, if someone's handling the Bible poorly, it doesn't matter culturally where they're from or what they're doing.
Yeah.
The issue is, no, actually handle the Bible properly.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing that you want to be universal. The Bible handled well
Yeah.
and then communicated appropriate to the culture.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like music. You want the worship of a church in a culture to be theologically on target. You know, you don't want it to be sort of fluffy, random nonsense. You know, some sort of biblical, theological quality is a sign of a healthy church and so on. But you don't want to strip away all the musical uniqueness of a culture. You know, and it's awkward to go to a country that's full of rhythm and dance and movement and then have people standing stiff singing old English hymns.
Yeah.
You know, and it's the same with preaching. You can sort of anglicize preaching and not help them at all.
Yeah.
Because it's a style.
Yeah.
Whereas if people are helped to really trust the Bible, to really get into it, to really communicate it, and then set free to do that in a way that connects with the people in front of them, which they're better at, you know, there's a lot of benefit to that. But there's the other side to that as well. Sometimes seeing other cultures helps you understand weaknesses in your own. That's one thing I've really appreciated, is to sort of have the outsider perspective on, okay, what don't we do well in this country? You know, what do the Americans do better? Or what do the Australians do better? Or what do the Africans do better? And those are broad categories, you know, like they're not all the same person, obviously, but sometimes often I think traveling will give you a perspective on your own culture where you grow to appreciate it more, but you also grow to see the weaknesses more. And I think we need that.
Yeah, and that's, I think, if you do have the privilege of traveling outside of your own country, even outside of your own kind of region of countries, those things that we're saying, the global cultural differences is pretty easy to spot very quickly. Mm-hmm. But maybe, well, there are other cultures that we've been reflecting on that are perhaps less obvious or less easy to spot.
So, for example, I don't know if this is what you're getting at now, but the multicultural reality of our own country, you know, that we can talk about traveling to Asia, traveling to Africa, traveling to America, but you'll meet people with foreign accents all around.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean for how we preach in our melting pot?
Even just thinking in the UK, mm-hmm. some places are on the surface more multicultural than others, or some are on the surface less multicultural than others, but there are multi-cultures really everywhere.
There are.
Kind of different levels and stuff, as of course, but it's being aware of your community area.
And yeah, I mean, when we moved to the town where we are, Chippenham, we came from Greater London. Not saying that London's greater, you know, the area Greater London, to Little Chippenham, and it felt very non-multicultural.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Just, whoa, this feels different. Yeah. And yet, just a few years into our church's existence, we had an international day. We thought, okay, what countries are represented? And I forget the number, but it was in the teens at least.
Double figures,
yeah. And you think, whoa, this is far more multicultural than it felt like when I first moved here.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of that, you know, in most settings. It's very rare to have a purely monocultural congregation.
And so that doesn't mean that I don't think it means when you're preaching in our church, you're thinking, okay, I need to preach like a Colombian because there's a Colombian family in the church. That's your chance to say that you do. No, okay. But it's but you need to be, and you are. We are aware that not everyone is British like me.
Yeah. And it means it's so easy to fall into using illustrations from 1980s, 1990s English television. And
Yeah.
I think, oh, hang on a minute. Just because I watched that, I'm looking out, and there's a whole load of people in this church that didn't watch that.
Yeah.
They've got no clue what I'm referring to.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of a targeted relevance to my culture that isn't appropriate for my congregation. That's kind of weird to think about, but it's true.
Yeah, definitely. And even your kind of age potentially even is kind of
Well,
thing.
you're just saying I'm old. No, that's fine.
There are people older than you, but
But only just.
not many.
Not many anymore. But yeah, and I think as well as that multicultural dynamic, there's also the multiple cultures within a society. Even, careful how I phrase this, but even if we set aside the immigration and the multiple backgrounds represented, even if you think in terms of someone who is in Greater London compared to someone who's in rural Shropshire, or someone who's in a northern city in the UK. And the same could be said in the US. Someone in the South, someone in the Pacific Northwest, someone in the Boston, New York, kind of New England, Northeast.
Yeah. So
they're different.
Where there are different, and the differences are not just accents, but where there are different accents, there tends to be different languages, different cultures, but different accents tend to have different cultures too. And yeah, that's what you're saying, isn't it? It's just there's an awareness that there are different accents in the same country.
Yeah, exactly. It's more. Yeah, there's more than different accents. There's different people, different subcultures, and so I need to be aware of that, because if I'm coming from the southwest of England with a slightly southwesterly accent, South Bristol, sort of a Bristol accent, but with some American mixed in. Does that connect? Does that communicate? What does that communicate if I go into a sort of Hertfordshire, Oxford, Cambridge, highly educated part of the country? What does it communicate if I go up north, which is a very distinct culture? And I feel it more when I travel to North America, because, oh, you're English, they love that. But actually, I'm different within my own country as well. And there'll be some churches where people will lean forward as they hear my accent, and there'll be other churches that will slightly judge because of the accent. And that may be reversed when someone else goes to the same churches. But I think it's good to be aware of that, just to recognize, okay, different cultures, and I think a classic example, there was a guy that used to come to our church when I was growing up, one of my favorite visiting speakers from Maesteg in South Wales. Yeah. And he used to sort of almost give a report of what was happening there, but it was always humorous and it was always self-deprecating. And it just relaxed people. People just kind of breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, this guy's fun to listen to. And then he'd preach, and the preaching was great. But just that sort of self-awareness, rather than, I suppose the opposite would be a lack of self-awareness. Yeah. So that can be a help, definitely. I just thinking as well, just kind of jumping across the Atlantic, you've got different areas and cultures in the US. And I remember being at a conference where there was an African-American preaching with that sort of call response style, which is so foreign to me as an English person. We just don't have that at all. And the first few minutes, I didn't know where I was. It's like, whoa, what's going on? All these, he's speaking, people are responding. There's so much energy in this. But actually, he handled the Bible remarkably well. And that just made it one of the highlight messages for me, hearing that. Even though it was from a different culture with a different style, it was that Bible handling that just made it absolute treasure to listen to.
One of the culture that perhaps we're not immediately aware of, that we've been reflecting on, is just the difference in culture of really just within churches. There's a church culture. I guess church culture within a national culture is different as well.
Yeah.
And that's, fine and easy, perhaps easier to talk about. But I guess what we're thinking is actually sort of my church culture is different to other church
Yeah,
cultures
that's right.
in the same kind of area.
And again, it's good to get exposure to things that are different. That helps you to understand what's normal to you, because otherwise you just assume that's what preaching is, what
Yeah.
you've always heard, and you'll just replicate it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's the case. Yeah, is what the things that we've seen and we know we tend to do, for good and bad. But then also, yeah, if my view of preaching is this particular way of doing it is the best only way, that's so narrow and just not helpful.
No, I just don't see how you cannot be better off being exposed and aware of different approaches.
Yeah,
So if, let's say you grew up in a church that is ardently committed to verse by verse preaching. You preach verse by verse. At the end of the time, you stop. Next week, you pick it up at the next verse, and you just keep going. There's some real strengths to that, and some. I would imagine people that are in that kind of church would get quite a biblical education as long as the preaching is on target, verse by verse. But there's also some weaknesses to it and some missed opportunities, I think. And so, yeah, I think, if that's your background, celebrate it, appreciate it, even continue it, but do so with an awareness of perhaps the blind spots in it. If your background is 3 points and a hymn to close, or a poem at the end, a nice applicational finale, great. Continue that tradition, but be aware that there may be some other approaches. Not every sermon has to be deductive. Not every point has to begin with the same letter in order for it to be true preaching. And so, yeah, just recognize your church has its own unique subculture within the national culture. And the more we can be aware of that, the better.
yeah, exactly that.
All right, just to close then, the familiar phrase out of Revelation 5, just thinking about different cultures, different countries, different cultures, different, the sort of multi-ethnic, multinational, different combinations of things that are happening in the church. It's such an exciting thing, when you compare the church to cults that put their standard shaped building with white picket fence in the middle of a desert, and teach people to act like they're from a certain state. That's uniformity, and it's so sad compared to the richness of the church. When you read Revelation 5 and the voices crying out, singing, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." That's the beauty of what we're part of. We want everyone to handle the Bible well, but we don't want everyone to look like us. And so that sort of ministry that Jonathan Lamb has been speaking about, that we've been discussing, recognizing the richness, appreciating the richness of the church that Christ has pulled together. One day we're going to see it, and I think it's going to take our breath away.
We can go into the week with that in ringing in our hearts and knowing that God is for all the nations. We're grateful for you joining us again on this podcast episode, and we'll be with you again soon.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate every positive review, like, share, and comment. And thank you for praying for us. We hope you will join us again next time on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.